Hey guys, welcome back to the Historian's Craft. So, in this video, and I'm going to try to make this as short as I possibly can. That might be a little tough because I'm not working from a script. This is strictly going to be off the top of my head. But I want to talk for a minute here because I was doing some research for a video on Japan in the Second World War. And I figured it would be a good idea to kind of do a precursor video to that one. So in this one, what I want to do is talk about the role of Polaris, the North Star, in the development of Stae Shinto and Japanese ultranationalism and, I suppose, war fervor during the Meiji Restoration, so about 1868 to about 1912, and then the impact it has on Japanese ultranationalism going into the Second World War, so 1939 or 1937, really for East Asia up until 1945. So, this video then is going to start not in Japan, but actually in China, specifically in Ming Dynasty, and then going into Qing Dynasty China. So, it's during the Ming Dynasty that, and this happens a little bit before too, but really during the Ming Dynasty, that the doctrine, the philosophy of Confucianism starts to get reworked a little bit into what we now know as Neo-Confucianism. So what I'm focusing on in this video, because Neo-Confucianism is its own massive topic, is in Neo-Confucianism, the whole point of knowledge is that the world can be understood rationally. Okay, so when Neo-Confucianism sets up its cosmology, the whole thing with the yin-yang, this idea of dualism in Chinese philosophy, male, female energy, earth, air, fire, water, heaven, hell, that kind of thing. That's only one stage. That's only one part of the Neo-Confucian cosmology. It symbolizes two halves of a whole. Well, if you go beyond that, you come into this other philosophical concept of oneness or wholeness called the Taiji. Now, the Taiji is believed to be the singular source in Neo-Confucian philosophy from which all reality flows. And reality, through human senses and the human intellect, is able to be understood. So it tries to be a somewhat rationalized philosophy. It tries to get rid of some of the more mystical and somewhat religious elements from Confucianism, which have somewhat bled in over the past few centuries through things like Buddhism. So this idea of the Taiji, the singular point from which all reality flows in Neo-Confucianism, is symbolized by Polaris, the North Star. Now, why is it symbolized by Polaris? And the answer is because Polaris is the singular point. When you look up into the heavens, it's the celestial body, the star which doesn't move. Everything revolves around the North Star, which means then it must be central. This must be the Taiji, the central point from which everything flows. Now, Neo-Confucianism gets tweaked a little bit in Japanese philosophy during the Tokugawa period, so about 1600 to about 1868. And Tokugawa Neo-Confucianism largely becomes the basis upon which the Tokugawa Bakufu, the Tokugawa Shogunate, is established, because it lends itself to the creation of a series of bun, a series of class really is not the right translation. Maybe a better translation would be like status group or perhaps social group. So you have the emperor, the imperial court aristocracy, you have the shogun, the daimyo, and then you have different ranks of samurai, and then you have peasants, artisans, merchants, and then you have beneath them people that don't really fit in. These people that kind of live in villages and work with what Shinto considers to be impure, dirty aspects of life. They're tanners, they're grave diggers, they're butchers, that kind of thing. So this is the social order. And it's based, like I said, upon Neo-Confucianism, which comes out of China. And coming out of China as well as this concept of the Taiji, the North Star, the singular point from which all reality flows. Japanese intellectuals understood this fairly well, but in Japan, because you have the impact of things like Dutch trade, and then eventually when the Europeans and the Americans come along and they supposedly force Japan open to the West, even though that's not really how that happened, but that's a different topic. You get the impact and the influence of Western systems of thought, Western military technology, and Western politics and Western economic ideas. So this is all interacting with each other in Japan. Now, at the same time this is all going on, late 1700s into the 1800s, there was a movement in Japan to push away from all of this and really get back to, well, what do the original philosophies say? So you are then trying to read ancient Japanese texts, you're trying to read ancient Chinese texts to cut away all the BS of this revival of Neo-Confucianism and this revival of, other philosophies in the area, Taoism, etc., to get back to the original tenets of the ideas from which all these new doctrines come from. Now, to do that, to read these original texts that things like Neo-Confucianism are based on, you have to know the original language. You have to know what the words mean in the original documents. So this leads to the study of philology, the historical linguistics as contained in documents, so the history of language, basically. Now, when some Japanese intellectuals were doing this, they were looking at older Confucian texts, but they're also looking at older works of Japanese philosophy, and what they realized with the study of philology is that, well, if we're looking at the world in a dualist perspective, yin-yang, or um-yang, if you want to use that terminology, which tends to be more Korean than Chinese, but this whole idea that you have male-female energy, light, darkness, right? They're applying this dualism to language, and what they argue is, well, the grammar of Chinese is very strict. The grammar of Japanese is not so strict. It's a little more spontaneous, and because it's spontaneous, the Japanese language has a female energy, whereas the Chinese language has a male energy. Because the Japanese language, and therefore Japanese culture, has a female energy, it's spontaneous, and the female energy is where life comes from. Ooh, maybe some intellectuals now start playing with the idea that, well, maybe China is not Zhonghua. Maybe it's not the Middle Kingdom. Maybe it's not the Central Kingdom as Chinese intellectuals say it is. Maybe it's Korea. Maybe it's Japan. Well, in the 1700s and into the 1800s, when Europeans start enforcing this open door policy in China, and they start carving up China into different zones of colonial influence. These are called the spheres of influence. China loses control over itself, and the Japanese intellectuals who are playing with these ideas look at this and say, okay, China was conquered by the Qing, they were conquered by the Manchu, by barbarians, non-Chinese peoples. And then these Qing were not able to protect China against the Nanban, the southern barbarians. That's what they called the Europeans. So, if that's the case, well then, maybe China's not all it's cracked up to be. And if China can't protect itself against these barbarians, but we can because we haven't let them in, and we're able to kind of negotiate with these people, right? Japan has not been subjugated like China has. Well then maybe China's not the central kingdom of the world. And if it's not China and Japan, with this idea floating around of female energy and spontaneity, and this is where life comes from, this describes Japanese culture, maybe Japan's the central kingdom of the world. Maybe Japan's the focal point of everything. So these ideas start mishmashing and blending with each other. And then you get this idea of the Taiji, the center from which all reality flows. In Neo-Confucianism, and Japanese intellectuals in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, influenced by all of this, say, well, if the Taiji is the center from which all reality flows, but if China's not the center of the world, if that means then that Neo-Confucianism is wrong, well, it just so happens that we, the Japanese, we have our own understanding of this. So we, in English, we use the word emperor to describe the head of the Japanese imperial family. That's not really what the Japanese term tenno means. Tenno means something more along the lines of heavenly sovereign of the North Star. That's one way of translating it, and I'm translating it in that manner to draw attention to this concept of the North Star in Japanese thought already being associated with the emperor. So what I'm hoping you see then is what the Japanese intellectuals are going to do next. They're going to say, okay, if Japan is the real focal point of culture in East Asia and possibly the world, because according to the dualism inherent in East Asian philosophy, Japan has the female energy, they're spontaneous, they're motherly, that's where life comes from, that's where civilization comes from. And that, combined with this idea that the emperor is associated with the North Star, which no longer is associated with Neo-Confucianism, but you have this idea that this is where reality comes from. Well then, in Japanese thought, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it becomes conflated with this idea that the emperor is the central focal point from which all reality then flows. And if Japan is a spontaneous culture, if the language of Japan, if the grammar is more spontaneous, more flexible than Chinese, so these people believed, well then, to be Japanese is to be spontaneous. It's to think with your gut. It is to have a red soul. That is, in Japanese thought, it is to have a soul that is the color of the sun, the color of life, right? Blood. To be spontaneous, to be driven by emotion. Whereas if you have a black soul, that is the color of death and decay. And that then means that you are a demon, you are an oni. So this leads into Japanese ultranationalism in the Second World War period, because if Japan is the center of everything and the emperor is the source from which all reality flows because he's associated with the North Star, well then the spreading of the Japanese colonial empire across East Asia is a divine holy mission that the emotional, non-rational Japanese must undertake for the betterment of their own pure self, their own minzoka, and their own divinely ordained mission, the spreading of Japan across the world. And they're doing this to unify their brethren, the East Asians, against the people that they believe to be the black-souled demons, the oni, the demons with white skin, the European colonialists. So this is a brief spiel about how everything interconnects, and this is going to lead into the trilogy of videos I have on the Japanese perspective of World War II and how and why they were fighting it. So guys, that's it for now. I realize it was a bit of a ramble. But if you're interested in this stuff, this kind of esoteric Japanese East Asian mysticism and Neo-Confucianism and philosophies of that sort, check the bibliography I'm going to list below, or drop me a comment and I'll respond probably in a more coherent manner than I did this video. So that's it for now. Take care. Thanks for watching. I will see you all next time.